Terror in Bogota and Mexico is burning. We'll talk about both of them and more on this explosive episode of The Hot Zone.
This is The Hot Zone. Engaging with the news in a whole new way, international war correspondent Chuck Holton brings insight into areas of crisis and lets you help those affected.
Hey folks, it's Monday, January 21st, and we got lots to get to today. There were two terrible tragedies over the weekend. First, 21 people were murdered in Bogota, Colombia, after a giant car bomb was detonated at a graduation ceremony in that city on Friday. It happened at the National Police Academy during an advancement event for new cadets. A terrorist drove an SUV through the security gate at the academy and smashed into a building before detonating an estimated 88 pounds of explosives. The effects were devastating. While nobody's claimed responsibility, the bombing's being attributed to the National Liberation Front, or ELN, which is one of the few remaining rebel groups that's still fighting the Colombian government. The other main rebel group is the FARC, which was itself responsible for many similar bombings in the past, but they came to an agreement with the Colombian government last year and agreed to lay down their arms and become a political party rather than a militia. But the ELN is really more of a criminal gang or cartel that just hides behind a political ideology. They have very leftist leanings, for sure, and have always been in opposition to the more right-wing Colombian government that's currently in power. Now, on Friday morning, a man was arrested in Bogota in connection with the bombing after he made a phone call, which was intercepted by the Colombian authorities. During that call, the accused terrorist admitted to helping prepare and detonate that bomb. Now, over the weekend, Colombians came out across the country for marches and candlelight vigils to denounce terrorism and honor their police. Many Colombians still remember the very dark days of the 80s when bombings were a lot more commonplace, and they never want to go back to that kind of violence again. In reality, Colombia is actually a whole lot safer than most people think. Years ago, drug cartels in the country were so powerful, most especially Pablo Escobar and the Medellin cartel, of which he was the leader. Back then, bombs like this were a fairly regular occurrence. It got so bad at one point that the U.S. government told all of their personnel they were prohibited from traveling around the country by vehicle and could only use helicopters. But this explosion is the first major terror attack in Colombia in almost a decade. These days, terror attacks across Latin America are really very, very rare because, frankly, there's not a lot of Muslims in Latin America. And like it or not, the vast majority of terror attacks, like 80% of them across the globe, are perpetrated by radical Islamic jihadists. But in Colombia, while the ELN and to some extent the FARC are essentially espousing a Marxist philosophy, the fight isn't actually over ideology so much as it is over the tremendous amount of natural resources Colombia sits on, as well as the lucrative and growing cocaine trade. Now, those two things mean tens of billions of dollars a year that can be gleaned by those criminal organizations. In an earlier episode of this show, I talked about the illegal gold mining operations that are rampant across Colombia and told the story of a family that has been in artisanal gold mining for generations. The owner of that mine told me the gangs basically come in and make slaves out of these little mom and pop gold miners who then have to work 5 or 6 days a week just to pay the war tax being imposed by the criminal gangs, and then they try to live on the leftovers. Eladio Antonio Suarez comes from a long line of miners. He's been mining here for the past 12 years.
The actual mines are down below. We bring the gold up with a winch.
He feels fortunate to work in an area that sees little cartel influence.
In these parts, it's very difficult to make a living. We end up working for the cartels whether we like it or not. You have to be on their side or else.
The 100-year-old mine shaft burrows deep into the mountain, and down here the work is difficult and dangerous. We're now several hundred meters underground, and they estimate there's over $20 billion worth of gold in these mountains. The question is how to get it out. These miners are trying to get their share of it by loading 2 or 3 tons of rock a day by hand into these mine cars and taking them up topside. This mine is now considered legal, but Suarez does not have good things to say about the process or the Colombian government, which has added massive regulations and up to 70% tax on his profits.
We're gonna have to get a new generator to process the gold faster and easier, since the states keeps putting more regulations on us. It's the only way to make a profit. Once they get done taking their taxes out, we aren't left with much.
Most people aren't aware that there's an ongoing enormous refugee crisis inside Colombia, nearly as bad as that in Syria, with millions of people, of Colombians, internally displaced because of the brutal criminal gangs which really continue to rule remote parts of that country. The numbers are actually pretty staggering. It's said that the cartels are now making 5 times as much money from illegal gold extraction than they are from trafficking cocaine, which is by itself pretty significant. Colombia has some of the largest gold reserves in the world, and these mom and pop artisanal gold miners have been a thing for literally hundreds of years. The miner that we spoke to said the government operates almost like another criminal gang when it comes to their approach to the miners, because they levy a 70% tax on the gold being taken out of the ground and require the miners to spend far more money obtaining permits and certifications for their mines. And also they require them to adhere to very strict environmental regulations, which end up being quite costly. Colombia's overall violent crime rate's actually lower than that of Panama, where I live. But of course, it really depends on where you go and what you do. As I always tell people, as long as you don't go stupid places at stupid times and do stupid things with stupid people, you can probably travel safely to just about anywhere. Medellin today is really a beautiful and fairly safe city where my wife and I have gone for weekend getaways. It's cheap and there's a lot to do and the food is amazing. So I don't know if I'd be too worried about traveling to Colombia because of this bombing. It's pretty out of the ordinary, and especially because one of the bombers was killed, from what I'm told, in the attack. Although I don't know if it was intentional or not, but suicide bombings are almost unheard of in Latin America. The bottom line is, as long as you're smart and careful, you could go to Colombia and really have an enjoyable and cheap vacation, as long as you stay out of the more remote areas near the Venezuelan border or in the south. Now, there's one other refugee problem that Colombia is facing, and it's a huge wave of people fleeing Venezuela and living in refugee camps in Bogota and elsewhere around the country. This has led to an increase in petty theft, and as desperate migrants resort to stealing in order to survive. And there have been reports of violence between Colombian and Venezuelan prostitutes, because the Colombian women are angry that the Venezuelans will work that much cheaper. Now, I hope to go to Venezuela later on. Actually, well, my wife won't let me go to Venezuela, but I hope to go to the Colombian border with Venezuela next month after I get back from Syria. I want to take a closer look at these stories and then report, especially on the migrant situation. It really could affect the United States, because now there's a push to grant Venezuelans temporary protected status, which would mean that Venezuelan refugees who come to the United States would be immediately admitted for asylum. And this obviously would cause a large increase in the number of Venezuelans heading to our shores. In years past, they've really only had a couple thousand or a few thousand each year. I have to say, though, if any country in Latin America ought to have TPS, it's probably Venezuela. I mean, look at what's going on in that country. It's horrific. I've spoken with Venezuelan migrants who've come to the United States and to Panama, and they all say the trip is very dangerous, especially in Colombia, where you're virtually guaranteed to get robbed or raped if you cross that country as a migrant. Apparently, even the government forces are getting in on the act, and since there's so many migrants coming through there, they've elevated the pillaging of these helpless and needy travelers to really an institutional level, which is really unfortunate. It doesn't actually seem to function as much of a deterrent either, for some reason. The people just keep coming. Okay, our next story has to do with another explosion, this one in Mexico. Back on episode 21, I think, on the 7th of January, I talked about the huge problem Mexico's having with oil theft, or fuel theft, as cartels and criminal gangs are literally digging up Mexican fuel pipelines and then tapping into them to steal the gasoline inside and then sell it on the black market. Many people there kind of see gas theft as a Robin Hood type thing, which, like stealing from the rich state-owned oil company and then selling the fuel cheap to the poor. But late last week, it all went very, very wrong. On Friday, there was a huge explosion that happened on one of the pipelines about 60 miles north of Mexico City, where a bunch of fuel thieves and locals were tapping a giant pipeline and accidentally set off the gasoline they were stealing. Here's footage of what it looked like before the explosion. People gathering around a geyser of gasoline shooting high into the air. Now, I just have to say, if you walked up on this scene and there was gasoline spewing out of the ground like this, I mean, imagine what that would smell like. Would you really want to be anywhere near that? But these people are lining up to collect free gas in buckets and garbage cans and things like that. And that's just really, really a bad idea. I mean, come on, it's gasoline, people. Ay, ay, ay. Now there's more than 70 people dead and dozens more badly burned. The footage afterwards looks like the apocalypse or maybe the end of a movie starring The Rock. According to local news, the president, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, has now said he's going to take an even harder stand against fuel theft because he says it costs the state of Mexico over $3 billion a year, and much of that money is going to the cartels to diversify their cash flow away from other useful humanitarian pursuits like human trafficking and drug smuggling. And this isn't the first time Mexico has suffered a big pipeline explosion. As you can imagine, bad things are likely to happen when people are literally drilling holes in a metal pipeline full of gasoline. And back in 2010, there was another big explosion that killed 28 people, including 13 children, and burned down a couple thousand homes across a 10-kilometer area in a place called San Martin Texmelucan. According to local news in Mexico, fuel thieves have drilled into fuel pipelines almost 13,000 times in the last year. I mean, those things must look like Swiss cheese at this point. The government's deployed more than 3,000 Mexican Marines to guard their pipelines. It doesn't sound like they're making a whole lot of difference, though. And imagine the environmental impact of all that gasoline leaking out everywhere. Not only that, the cartels have been buying off the employees who work at refineries. So they just pay them to look the other way when they literally drive trucks full of gasoline out of the refinery's front gates. This is leading to a real big fuel shortage in the country, and that's starting to have effects beyond Mexico. As a matter of fact, they're saying we may not be able to make guacamole much longer until the Mexican government gets a handle on this. And that, my friends, is a real crisis. I mean, code red, stop everything, forget about the government shutdown, because hot houses that grow our avocados in Mexico are not going to be able to get their product to market. And missing out on my guacamole is very, very bad. So I hope the Mexican government can get this fixed quickly. And if you're planning a road trip down there, you might want to bring a couple extra cans of fuel or maybe a fire extinguisher. Well, that's all we have for today, folks. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to go support the podcast, just look up patreon.com/hotzone and subscribe. It's only $3 a month. Think about that. You can spare $3 a month, can't you? Especially if it means you get free books and lots of other cool extras. And I give you my solemn promise that every dime will go to people in need. Well, I'm hoping to donate some of that eventually to the Starving Holton Children Fund. But for now, we're just going to see how many people we can help with it. And you've heard me mention I'm heading off to Syria this week. So pray for me, would you? I'm going to be traveling with Dave Eubank and his merry band of Free Kurdish Rangers. If you haven't seen the documentary we did about Dave and his last trip to Iraq, you definitely should go watch it right this minute. It is the best piece of television I think I've ever had a part in making. So we'll see you back here tomorrow. I'm Chuck Holton, and this has been The Hot Zone.
The Hot Zone is produced by Amy Holton and Livefire Media. Copyright 2019.